Looking back on that moment, I realized that some conversations change everything, even when you think you've already lost everything worth changing. The woman standing at my door with three oversized suitcases and a triumphant smile had been systematically dismantling my peace of mind for 43 years, but this time felt different. This time, she'd crossed a line I hadn't even known existed until she stepped over it with both feet and a declaration that made my blood freeze in my veins. My name is Cordelia Whitmore, and until that Tuesday afternoon in September, I thought I'd figured out how to manage my mother. I'd spent the better part of 4 decades learning her patterns, anticipating her manipulations, and building walls high enough to protect what mattered most to me. I'd gotten good at it too, really good. The kind of good that comes from years of practice and the hard-won wisdom that some people never change, no matter how much you love them or how desperately you want them to. But standing there in my doorway, watching Euphemia Castleridge announce her latest scheme with a kind of casual confidence that suggested she'd already moved past any possibility of opposition, I felt something crack inside my carefully constructed defenses. Not break exactly, but crack in a way that let something dangerous leak through. Something I'd been keeping locked away for a very long time. The house behind me was quiet, in the way that only comes after years of living alone by choice. I'd bought the Victorian cottage in Millbrook Heights 5 years earlier, after my divorce from Preston was finalized, and I finally had the financial freedom to create exactly the kind of space I wanted. 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a kitchen that opened onto a garden I'd spent countless weekends nurturing into something that felt like sanctuary. It wasn't large, but it was mine in every way that mattered. The mortgage was in my name, the deed bore only my signature, and every decision about paint colors and furniture placement had been mine alone to make. That solitude had been hard won. My marriage to Preston had been one of those slow-motion disasters that takes 20 years to finally crash completely. He wasn't a bad man exactly, just one of those people who never quite figured out how to be fully present in his own life. We'd drifted apart so gradually that by the time I filed for divorce, we were practically strangers sharing a mortgage and a collection of polite dinner conversations about the weather. The settlement had been fair, even generous. He'd kept the downtown condo and most of our investments. I'd taken this house and enough money to feel secure for the first time in decades. My mother had disapproved of the divorce. Naturally, in her worldview, marriage was a commitment you honored, regardless of whether it brought you any actual happiness. She'd made her feelings clear through a series of pointed comments about my selfishness and my apparent inability to work through problems like an adult. The irony wasn't lost on me, considering that Euphemia Castleridge had been working through her own problems by making them everyone else's responsibility for as long as I could remember. She was 76 years old and still beautiful in that imperious way that some women never lose, no matter how many decades pass. Her silver hair was perfectly styled, her makeup applied with the kind of precision that spoke to morning routines refined over decades. Even standing on my doorstep with luggage, she looked like she was prepared to hold court rather than ask for help, which, I supposed, was exactly what she thought she was doing. "Well," she said, stepping past me into my living room without waiting for an invitation, "aren't you going to help me with these bags?" The casual presumption in her voice hit me like a physical blow. Not just that she expected me to help, but that she expected me to be grateful for the opportunity to do so. It was so perfectly, quintessentially her that I almost laughed. Almost. Instead, I closed the door behind her and tried to process what she just told me. The apartment. Her apartment. The one she'd been living in for the past 15 years. The same apartment I'd helped her find after Dad died. The one I'd co-signed for because her Social Security alone wasn't quite enough to cover the rent. The apartment where I'd spent countless Sunday afternoons helping her organize her medications and listening to her catalog the various ways her neighbors were failing to meet her standards of appropriate behavior. "You gave it to Dashiell," I said, more to confirm what I'd heard than because I didn't believe it. "Your apartment, you gave it to my brother." She set down her largest suitcase with a satisfied thump and turned to face me, her expression bright with the kind of enthusiasm that always preceded her most devastating announcements. Isn't it wonderful? He was having such trouble finding a place he could afford, what with the divorce and everything, and you know how these things go with rental applications these days, all those credit checks and references. It seemed like the perfect solution. The perfect solution for Dashiell, certainly, my 45-year-old brother who'd spent most of the last decade bouncing between jobs, relationships, and increasingly creative explanations for why none of his problems were ever really his fault. The same brother who'd borrowed $12,000 from our parents 3 years ago to invest in a business opportunity that had evaporated within 6 months, leaving behind nothing but a garage full of exercise equipment that no one wanted to buy. "What about your lease?" I asked, grasping for some logical thread that might unravel this entire situation. You can't just transfer a rental agreement to someone else without the landlord's approval. Mother waved her hand dismissively, as if such mundane concerns were beneath serious consideration. "Oh, that's all taken care of. Dashiell spoke to Mr. Hensworth yesterday. Such a reasonable man. He was perfectly happy to make the change, especially when Dashiell explained that he'd be taking over all the responsibilities. All the responsibilities, which included, I realized with growing dread, the monthly rent that I'd been helping cover for the past 3 years. Ever since Mother's arthritis had gotten bad enough that she couldn't work her part-time job at the flower shop anymore, I'd been quietly supplementing her income with $400 a month. Not a fortune by any stretch, but enough to make the difference between her living independently and, well, apparently, and this. "And you didn't think to discuss this with me first," I said, keeping my voice carefully level, "before making arrangements that affect both of us." She looked genuinely puzzled by the suggestion, as if the idea that her decisions might require input from others was a foreign concept. "Discuss what, dear? This is family helping family. I thought you'd be pleased that Dashiell finally has some stability in his life." Stability. That was rich. Dashiell had never shown any interest in stability that required actual effort on his part. His version of stability typically involved finding someone else to shoulder the practical responsibilities while he focused on whatever new scheme or passion project had captured his imagination. Last year it had been artisanal soap making. The year before that, cryptocurrency day trading. Before that, a food truck that had never quite made it past the planning stages. Now, apparently, it was living in our mother's apartment while she moved in with me, without asking. without even considering that I might have thoughts or feelings about such an arrangement, without acknowledging that my carefully constructed independent life might not have room for a permanent house guest, especially one with as many opinions about everything as Euphemia Castleridge. "How long are you planning to stay?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "Oh, indefinitely, I suppose," she said, settling onto my sofa as if she'd been doing it for years. "It's not like I have anywhere else to go now, is it? Besides, this works out perfectly for everyone. Dashiell gets a place to live, I get to spend more time with my daughter, and you get the company. You've been rattling around in this big house all by yourself for far too long. It's not natural for a woman your age to be so isolated." Isolated. The word hung in the air between us, heavy with implications and assumptions that made my chest tight with familiar anger. This was classic mother. Take a situation that served her purposes, find a way to frame it as being for everyone else's benefit, then act wounded if anyone questioned her logic. The fact that my so-called isolation had been a deliberate choice, a hard-won peace that I valued more than almost anything else in my life, was irrelevant to her narrative. I looked around my living room, trying to see it through her eyes. The comfortable furniture I'd chosen for myself, the books arranged exactly how I liked them, the carefully curated collection of art and photographs that told the story of my life on my own terms. In less than 10 minutes, my mother had turned all of it into a shared space without bothering to ask if I wanted to share it. "You can't just move in here," I said, though even as the words left my mouth, I realized how powerless they sounded. "This is my house, Mother, my space. I need you to understand that I wasn't prepared for this." She tilted her head slightly, the way she always did when she was about to deliver what she considered to be wisdom. "Preparation is overrated, dear. Life happens whether we're ready for it or not. The important thing is that we support each other through the challenges. Support each other." As if this were a mutual arrangement, instead of her unilaterally deciding to upend my life to solve a problem she'd created by giving away her apartment to my irresponsible brother. As if my decades of supporting her financially and emotionally hadn't already demonstrated my commitment to family obligations, as if she hadn't just proven, once again, that her idea of family support only flowed in one direction. The really infuriating part was how reasonable she made it all sound. Dashiell needed help. She needed a place to live. I had a house with spare bedrooms. Simple mathematics. If you ignored all the emotional and psychological factors that made it anything but simple. If you ignored the years of boundary-setting conversations that had apparently meant nothing to her. If you ignored the fact that I'd specifically chosen to live alone because I'd finally learned the difference between being lonely and being at peace. "What about your things?" I asked, looking at the 3 suitcases that represented what I assumed was her entire portable life. "Your furniture, your books, everything else." "Oh, Dashiell's keeping most of it," she said brightly. "The furniture works so well in that space, and he needs it more than I do. I brought the essentials, and I thought we could go shopping together for anything else I might need. Won't that be fun?" Fun. Shopping for furniture to accommodate my mother's unexpected permanent residency in my house. Rearranging my space, my routines, my entire carefully balanced life to make room for someone who hadn't bothered to ask if there was room. Someone who was already talking about our shared future as if it were an inevitable fact rather than something that required my agreement. I thought about my morning routine: coffee in the garden while I plan my day, reading in the breakfast nook with nobody to interrupt my thoughts, the blessed silence that let me work from home without distraction. My freelance editing business depended on that silence, on the ability to focus completely on the manuscripts that paid for this house and this independence. How was I supposed to maintain that with Mother holding court in my living room, offering commentary on everything from my choice of breakfast cereal to the way I answered my phone? "You seem upset," she observed, though her tone suggested mild curiosity rather than concern. "I thought you'd be happy to have me here. We've always been close." Close? Another one of her carefully chosen words that carried decades of complicated history. We'd been something, certainly, but I wasn't sure close was the right term for a relationship that had always felt more like a careful negotiation than a genuine connection. She'd been a demanding mother, the kind who expected her children to revolve around her needs and moods. I'd learned early to read her signals, to anticipate her requirements, to smooth over the disruptions she created in our family life. Dad had been the buffer, the gentle mediator who could usually redirect her energy into less destructive channels. Since his death, that role had fallen to me by default. Dashiell had never been much good at managing Mother's expectations, probably because she'd never expected much from him. He'd been the baby, the charming boy who could do no wrong even when he was doing plenty of it. I'd been the responsible one, the daughter who could be counted on to handle whatever needed handling. The dynamic had suited us all, in its way, but it had never been what I'd call close. "I need some air," I said, suddenly feeling claustrophobic in my own living room. "I'm going to walk to the corner market. We can talk about this when I get back." She nodded agreeably, already making herself comfortable on my sofa. "Take your time, dear. I'll just start getting settled in." Getting settled. The phrase followed me out the front door and down the tree-lined street I'd walked hundreds of times before. Always alone, always by choice, always as a way to clear my head and organize my thoughts. Today, the familiar rhythm of my feet on the sidewalk felt different, weighted with the knowledge that I'd be returning to a house that was no longer entirely mine. The September afternoon was crisp and bright, the kind of weather that usually lifted my spirits and reminded me why I loved this neighborhood. The Victorian houses sat back from the street behind mature oak trees and carefully tended gardens. Most of my neighbors were like me, middle-aged professionals who'd chosen this area for its quiet charm and sense of community without intrusion. We waved to each other, helped with packages when needed, but respected the boundaries that let everyone maintain their privacy. Now, I wondered what they'd think when they saw my mother coming and going, when they realized that my peaceful, single-woman household had been transformed overnight into something more complicated. Would they assume I'd invited her to live with me? Would they think I was one of those dutiful daughters who'd gladly sacrificed her independence for the sake of family obligation? The corner market was busy with the usual afternoon crowd of people picking up items for dinner, students buying snacks, retirees doing their daily shopping. I wandered the aisles without any real purpose, just needing the mundane distraction of other people's ordinary lives. At the checkout counter, Mrs. Chen smiled at me with her usual warmth. "Just the newspaper today?" she asked, ringing up the local weekly I'd grabbed without thinking. Yes, Just the newspaper, I confirmed, though what I really wanted to say was that everything else in my life had just been turned upside down by a 76-year-old woman with an unerring instinct for creating chaos at the worst possible moments. Walking back home, I tried to organize my thoughts into something resembling a plan. I could put my foot down, insist that Mother find another arrangement, but where would she go? She'd given her apartment to Dashiell, had packed up her life into 3 suitcases, had apparently burned her bridges with the kind of finality that suggested she'd thought this through more than her casual announcement had implied. I could call Dashiell, demand that he reverse whatever arrangement they'd made, but I knew my brother well enough to know that he'd already be settling into what he'd see as a long overdue stroke of good fortune. The idea of giving up a rent-controlled apartment in favor of being inconvenient would never occur to him, especially when the inconvenience would be mine rather than his. I could find Mother another place to live, help her get settled somewhere that didn't involve my guest bedroom becoming her permanent quarters, but that would take time and money and a level of cooperation from her that seemed unlikely given how pleased she was with her current solution. Or I could accept what appeared to be inevitable and try to make the best of a situation I'd never wanted and hadn't chosen, adjust my expectations, rearrange my life, find a way to maintain some semblance of the independence I'd worked so hard to achieve while accommodating the needs of someone who'd never shown much interest in accommodating anyone else's needs. By the time I reached my front door, I still didn't have a clear answer. But I did have a growing sense that this conversation was going to require more honesty than my family was accustomed to handling. Mother might think she'd presented me with a fait accompli, but she'd underestimated just how much my 5 years of living alone had changed me. I'd learned things about myself during that time, discovered strengths and preferences I'd never had the space to explore when I was constantly managing other people's expectations. She was still on my sofa when I walked back in, though she'd made herself even more comfortable. Her shoes were off, her feet tucked under her, and she'd found the remote control to my television. The afternoon talk show she was watching filled the quiet house with cheerful chatter about fall fashion trends and holiday decorating tips. "Feel better?" she asked, muting the sound when she saw me. "Actually, yes," I said, settling into the chair across from her. "I think I do." And that's when I realized what I was going to say next, the thing that had been building inside me during my walk, growing stronger with every step as I thought about everything that had led to this moment. All the years of being the responsible daughter, the reliable one, the person who could be counted on to handle whatever crisis or inconvenience needed handling. All the times I'd adjusted my life to accommodate other people's choices without being asked if I wanted to make those adjustments. I looked at my mother sitting in my living room with her suitcases and her assumptions and felt something settle into place that had been shifting around unsteadily for years. A kind of clarity that came from finally understanding exactly where my boundaries were and what I was prepared to do to defend them. "There's something I need to tell you," I said, and the tone in my voice must have been different from what she expected, because she straightened slightly, suddenly paying attention in a way she hadn't been since she'd arrived. "What is it, dear?" I took a breath, feeling the weight of what I was about to say and the absolute certainty that it needed to be said, regardless of how she reacted to it. This was the moment that would determine whether the next phase of our relationship would be built on her assumptions or my reality, whether I'd spend the next however many years slowly losing myself to her expectations, or whether I'd finally claim the right to live my own life on my own terms. The words were there, clear and unavoidable, waiting to transform everything between us with a kind of honesty that some families never quite manage to achieve. I could see exactly how she'd react, could predict the hurt and outrage and disbelief that would follow. But I could also see, perhaps for the first time, a path forward that didn't require me to sacrifice everything I'd built for the sake of keeping peace with someone who had never shown any interest in keeping peace with me. Actually, I said, and something in my voice made her lean forward slightly, I think you should know that this arrangement isn't going to work the way you've planned it. Her eyebrows rose, but she maintained that patient smile she always wore when she thought she was dealing with one of my temporary moods. Oh, and why is that? Because you've made a fundamental miscalculation about who I am now, I continued, feeling steadier with each word. You're operating on information that's at least 5 years out of date, maybe longer. She laughed, a light sound that managed to be both dismissive and indulgent. Cordelia, darling, you're my daughter. I think I know who you are. Do you? I asked, genuinely curious about her answer. Tell me then, who do you think I am? The question seemed to catch her off guard. She tilted her head, studying my face as if she were seeing something unexpected there. You're responsible, reliable. You've always been the one I could count on to do the right thing, even when it wasn't easy. And what's the right thing in this situation? Making room for family when family needs help, she said, without hesitation, taking care of the people you love, even when it requires sacrifice. That's what you do, Cordelia. That's who you've always been. There it was, laid out with perfect clarity, her entire understanding of me, our relationship, and this situation distilled into a few sentences that revealed just how little she actually knew about the person I'd become. The daughter she was describing had existed, certainly. That dutiful, self-sacrificing woman had been real for most of my adult life, but she'd been slowly disappearing over the past 5 years, replaced by someone who'd finally learned the difference between being loving and being available for exploitation. You're right about who I was, I said carefully, but you're wrong about who I am now. Her smile faltered slightly, the first crack in her confidence since she'd arrived. I don't understand. I know you don't. That's part of the problem. I stood up, needing to move while I found the words for what came next. The living room suddenly felt too small for this conversation, too contained for the scope of what I was about to reveal. I walked to the window that looked out over my garden, the space I'd created with my own hands, the sanctuary that had helped me discover who I was when I wasn't trying to be who someone else needed me to be. When Preston and I divorced, I said, still looking out at the late afternoon light filtering through the apple tree I'd planted 2 springs ago, something happened that I didn't expect. I thought I'd be devastated. I thought losing a 20-year marriage would break me into pieces that might never fit back together properly. I turned to face her, seeing confusion and the first stirrings of concern in her expression. But that's not what happened. Instead, I felt relief, not just about the marriage ending, but about finally having permission to stop pretending to be someone I wasn't, someone who was endlessly accommodating, endlessly available, endlessly willing to put everyone else's needs ahead of her own. "There's nothing wrong with being considerate," Mother said, though her tone had lost some of its earlier certainty. "You're absolutely right," I agreed. "Being considerate is a wonderful quality, but there's a difference between being considerate and being a doormat, between being loving and being an emotional support system for people who never offer the same support in return." She was quiet for a long moment, processing this in a way that suggested she was beginning to understand that this conversation wasn't following her expected script. "Are you saying I haven't been supportive of you?" The question hung in the air between us, heavy with decades of history that we'd both been carefully avoiding for years. All the times she'd criticized my choices, dismissed my concerns, assumed my availability without asking. All the crises that had somehow become my responsibility to solve, the emotional labor that had always flowed in one direction, the way my problems had always seemed less urgent than everyone else's needs. "I'm saying," I replied slowly, "that your idea of support has always been me supporting you rather than the other way around." Her face flushed slightly, though whether from anger or embarrassment, I couldn't tell. "That's not fair, Cordelia. I've always been there for you." "Have you?" I asked, genuinely curious about her answer. "When Preston and I were having problems, did you offer to listen? Or did you tell me I needed to try harder to make him happy? When I was struggling to figure out what I wanted to do with my career, did you ask what would fulfill me? Or did you suggest I find something practical that wouldn't interfere with taking care of my family? When I told you I was thinking about moving to this house, did you ask if it would make me happy? Or did you point out all the ways it was impractical?" Each question landed like a small stone thrown into still water, creating ripples of recognition that spread across her features. I could see her mentally reviewing those conversations, perhaps seeing them from my perspective for the first time. "I was trying to protect you," she said finally, her voice smaller than it had been since she'd arrived. "I didn't want you to make mistakes that would hurt you later." "Whose definition of mistake were you using?" I asked gently, because from my perspective, the biggest mistake I made was spending so many years trying to live up to other people's expectations instead of figuring out what I actually wanted. She was quiet again, her hands folded in her lap. Her earlier confidence completely evaporated. For the first time since she'd announced her living arrangements, she looked uncertain, vulnerable, in a way that reminded me of the rare moments in my childhood when her perfect composure had slipped enough to reveal the anxious woman underneath. "What are you saying?" she asked, and I could hear the genuine fear in her voice now. "That you don't want me here? That you're going to turn away your own mother?" This was the moment I'd been building toward, the point where I had to choose between the comfortable patterns of our past and the uncertain territory of complete honesty. I could see exactly how this would go if I backed down now. She'd interpret my hesitation as weakness, would settle into my house with the satisfied confidence of someone who'd successfully called a bluff. My life would gradually reshape itself around her needs and preferences, and in 6 months or a year, I'd wake up wondering how I'd lost myself again so quickly. Or I could say what I'd never said before, the words that had been gathering force during my walk to the market and crystallizing as we talked, the truth that would change everything between us, one way or another. I sat back down across from her, close enough to see the anxiety in her eyes, and took a breath that felt like the first real breath I'd taken since she'd appeared on my doorstep. "What I'm saying," I began, my voice steady and clear, "is something I should have said years ago. Something that might shock you, but something you need to hear if we're going to have any kind of honest relationship going forward." She leaned forward slightly, bracing herself for whatever was coming, and I felt the last of my hesitation dissolve. This was it, the moment that would define who we were going to be to each other from now on. "Mother," I said, looking directly into her eyes, "I've already called Dashiell. He's moving out of your apartment this weekend, and you're moving back in on Monday." The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the grandfather clock in my hallway ticking away the seconds. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed again, as if the words she'd been preparing to say had simply evaporated. The expression on her face shifted through several emotions in rapid succession: confusion, disbelief, anger, and finally something that looked almost like respect. "You what?" she whispered. "I called him while I was walking to the market," I continued, feeling a strange calm settle over me as I spoke the truth I'd been building toward for the entire conversation. I explained that his free apartment came with a hidden cost that I wasn't willing to pay, namely, having his problems become my problems, as they always seem to do. She stared at me for a long moment, processing this information in a way that suggested she was recalculating everything she thought she knew about the power dynamics in our family. "You can't just— Dashiell has already moved his things in. He's signed papers." "Actually, he can't sign papers for your lease," I said gently. "I should know, since my name is on the lease as guarantor. Has been for the past 3 years, ever since you needed someone to co-sign because your income alone wasn't sufficient. Something I don't think you mentioned to him when you were making your generous offer." The color drained from her face as she realized I'd just revealed the financial arrangement she'd clearly hoped to keep hidden. "Cordelia, I never intended for you to—" "To what?" "To find out that you've been making decisions about agreements that I'm legally responsible for without bothering to consult me? To discover that you assumed I'd just quietly absorb the consequences of whatever arrangement you made with Dashiell?" I stood up again, needing to move as the words continued to pour out of me with startling clarity. "Here's what's really interesting about this situation, Mother. When I talked to Dashiell this afternoon, he had no idea I'd been helping with your rent. He thought you'd been covering everything yourself with your Social Security and savings, which means you let him believe he was accepting charity from someone who could afford to give it, rather than someone who was already being subsidized by the person whose life you were about to disrupt." Her face had gone from pale to flushed, and I could see her struggling to regain the conversational footing she'd lost somewhere between my first question and this moment of complete honesty. That's private financial business between us. It wasn't relevant to Dashiell's situation, wasn't it? I asked. Because it seems pretty relevant to me. You made a decision that would have forced me to support both of you without asking either of us if that's what we wanted. You assumed I'd house and care for you indefinitely while continuing to subsidize his housing costs, also that everyone could avoid the inconvenience of actually solving their own problems. The words hung in the air between us, stark and undeniable. I could see her mental wheels turning as she tried to find a way to reframe this situation, to make it about my unreasonable expectations rather than her manipulative assumptions. But for once, her usual rhetorical strategies seemed to be failing her. "I'm your mother," she said finally, falling back on the argument that had always worked before. "Family helps family. That's what we do." "You're absolutely right," I agreed, surprising her. "Family does help family, but help implies choice, doesn't it? It implies asking rather than assuming, requesting rather than demanding. What you've been doing isn't helping, Mother. It's delegating your problems to other people and calling it love." She was quiet for a long moment, her hands twisted in her lap, and when she spoke again, her voice was smaller than I'd ever heard it. "Where am I supposed to go? You've taken away my apartment. You don't want me here. What am I supposed to do?" The vulnerability in her voice hit me harder than her anger would have, because it revealed the fear that had probably been driving her behavior all along. Not maliciousness exactly, but the kind of panic that comes from feeling like you're running out of options and time. I'd seen that same expression on her face after Dad's funeral, when the reality of managing her life alone had first hit her. "You're not listening," I said, sitting back down across from her. "I didn't take away your apartment. I told Dashiell he couldn't have it. There's a difference." She looked up at me, confusion replacing the hurt in her expression. "I don't understand." "Your apartment is still yours," I explained patiently. "Your lease, your furniture, your neighbors who complain about their music being too loud. Dashiell is moving back to whatever arrangement he had before you offered him this solution to his housing problems, and you're going home to your own place where you can make your own decisions about your own life without dragging me into them." The silence stretched between us as she processed this, and I could see her working through the implications, not just the practical ones, but the emotional ones as well. The message I was sending about independence, about boundaries, about the difference between being part of a family and being absorbed by one. "But I thought," she began, then stopped, seeming to realize that what she'd thought wasn't necessarily what I'd wanted or agreed to. "You thought I'd go along with whatever plan you'd made?" I finished for her. "You thought that because I've always gone along with your plans before, I'd continue to do so indefinitely. And you thought that because you've always been able to count on me to handle the practical details of your decisions, I'd handle these details too." She nodded slowly, and I could see something shifting in her expression. Not surrender exactly, but recognition. The dawning understanding that the daughter she'd been expecting to manage no longer existed, if she ever had. "When did you become so—" She paused, searching for the right word. "Strong," I suggested. "Self-aware? Unwilling to be taken for granted?" "Hard," she said finally, and the word carried years of accumulated disappointment. I considered this characterization, turning it over in my mind like a stone that might reveal different colors depending on how the light hit it. "Maybe I have gotten harder," I admitted. "Or maybe I've just gotten clearer about the difference between being loving and being exploited. Maybe what you're seeing as hardness is actually just me finally learning to value my own needs as much as I value everyone else's." She was quiet for a long time, staring down at her hands, and when she looked up again, there were tears in her eyes that she wasn't trying to hide. "I've been selfish, haven't I?" The question caught me off guard with its directness. I'd been prepared for anger, defensiveness, manipulation, guilt-tripping. I hadn't been prepared for this moment of stark self-recognition. "Yes," I said gently, You have been. She nodded, accepting this assessment with a resignation that suggested she'd probably known it already, somewhere beneath all her justifications and assumptions. I don't know how to be different. I know you don't, I said, and for the first time since she'd arrived, I felt something like compassion stir in my chest. But that doesn't mean you can't learn. She looked at me with something that might have been hope. How? It was such a simple question, but it opened up possibilities that I'd never considered before. Not just for her to change, but for us to have a different kind of relationship. One built on honesty instead of habitual patterns, on choice instead of obligation, on mutual respect instead of the complex dance of manipulation and resentment we'd been performing for decades. By starting with this conversation, I said, by admitting that the way we've been doing things hasn't been working for either of us, by agreeing that if we're going to be in each other's lives, we need to do it differently. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, a gesture that reminded me of the little girl she must have been once before life had taught her that controlling other people was easier than trusting them. What would that look like? I thought about this question while she waited, considering what kind of relationship might actually be possible between us if we could figure out how to see each other clearly. Not the mother and daughter of our family mythology, but the real women we were now, with our own needs and boundaries and capacity for growth. It would look like you asking before assuming, I said finally. It would look like me being honest about what I can and can't do instead of just going along with whatever you need until I explode from resentment. It would look like both of us accepting that caring about each other doesn't mean we're obligated to solve each other's problems. She nodded slowly, as if she were taking notes on a foreign language she was trying to learn. And if I mess up, if I fall back into old patterns, then we talk about it, I said. Instead of me silently accommodating and you remaining oblivious, we actually discuss what's happening and figure out how to do better. The idea seemed to both intrigue and terrify her. That sounds difficult. It is difficult, I agreed, but it's also honest. And I've discovered over the past 5 years that honest relationships, even when they're difficult, are infinitely better than easy relationships built on lies and resentment. We sat in silence for a few minutes, both of us absorbing the weight of what we'd just committed to attempting. Outside, the late afternoon sun was slanting through my windows at the golden angle that meant evening was approaching. Soon, I'd need to think about dinner, about the practical realities of having my mother as a guest for the next few days while she prepared to return to her own life. "Cordelia," she said finally, her voice tentative in a way I wasn't used to hearing. "Yes, I'm sorry for all of it, for taking you for granted, for making assumptions, for not seeing who you really are." She paused, gathering courage for what came next, and for not asking if you wanted company before deciding you needed it. The apology hit me with unexpected force, partly because it was so specific, so accurate in its acknowledgement of exactly what had gone wrong between us. This wasn't a general expression of regret, but a precise recognition of the choices she'd made and their impact on me. "Thank you," I said, meaning it completely. "That means more than you probably realize." She smiled then, a real smile that reached her eyes and transformed her face in a way I hadn't seen in years. "So what happens now?" I looked around my living room at the suitcases that would need to be repacked at the television that was still muted but flickering with images of the life she'd been planning to build in my space. Tomorrow, we'd need to call Mr. Hensworth and reverse whatever arrangements had been made with Dashiell. We'd need to coordinate the logistics of getting her moved back into her own place while he figured out his next steps. But those were practical problems, the kind that could be solved with phone calls and careful scheduling. The real question was what kind of relationship we were going to build from this point forward, now that we'd finally had the conversation we should have had years ago. Now, we figure out how to be family without being codependent, I said. We learn how to love each other without losing ourselves. She picked up the remote control and turned off the television, as if she were symbolically ending the afternoon she'd planned and accepting the reality of the one we were actually having. Will you help me pack? Of course, I said, standing up and offering her my hand. But first, let's call Dashiell together. I think he needs to hear from both of us about why this arrangement isn't going to work. She took my hand and let me pull her to her feet, and for a moment we stood there in my living room, two women who'd just figured out how to see each other clearly for the first time in decades. It wasn't the reunion she'd planned, and it wasn't the confrontation I dreaded. It was something else entirely. The beginning of a relationship based on truth instead of assumption. My phone call with Dashiell that evening was exactly as difficult as I'd expected it to be. He'd already started moving his things into Mother's apartment, had already made plans based on the windfall of rent-free housing. His initial reaction was predictable: anger, accusations that I was being unreasonable, attempts to guilt me into reconsidering by pointing out how much he needed this break. But when Mother took the phone and explained her own role in creating this situation, something shifted in the conversation. Not immediately, and not without considerable protest from Dashiell, but eventually he seemed to understand that this wasn't just me being difficult. This was the entire family finally acknowledging that our usual pattern of passing problems around until they landed on someone who couldn't pass them any further wasn't sustainable anymore. You're really going to make me find another place? He asked, and I could hear the genuine worry beneath his frustration. I'm really going to stop enabling you to avoid finding your own solutions, I corrected gently. Those are two very different things. The conversation that followed was long and sometimes heated, but it ended with him agreeing to be moved out by Sunday evening. Not happily, and not without multiple reminders about how hard this was going to be for him, but with acceptance that the free apartment had never really been free to begin with. After we hung up, Mother and I spent the evening going through her suitcases, sorting what she'd need for the next few days from what could wait until she was back in her own space. It was strange. This domestic activity we'd never shared before. In all the years I'd helped her with various crises and needs, we'd never simply sat together organizing her belongings while talking about ordinary things. I brought too many books, she observed, pulling novels from the bottom of her largest suitcase. I was planning to set up a reading corner in your spare bedroom. You can still have a reading corner, I said, in your own apartment, arranged exactly how you like it. She smiled, an expression that held both sadness and relief. I'd forgotten how much I liked my apartment. My chair by the window, my kitchen where everything is exactly where I put it, my neighbors who I can complain about or ignore as the mood strikes me. Why did you give it up? I asked, curious about the thought process that had led to such a dramatic decision. She was quiet for a moment, folding a sweater with careful precision. I was scared, she said finally, about getting older, about being alone, about what would happen if I got sick or couldn't take care of myself anymore. When Dashiell mentioned his housing problems, it seemed like a solution to several problems at once. But you never asked if it was a solution I wanted to be part of, I pointed out, not accusingly, but as a statement of fact. No, I didn't, she agreed. I assumed you'd want to take care of me the way I took care of my mother when she got older. This was the first time she'd ever mentioned her own mother's later years, and I realized there were whole chapters of her life I'd never heard about. What was that like, taking care of Grandma Ruth? Her expression grew complicated, filled with emotions I couldn't easily read. Suffocating, she said quietly. She moved in with your father and me when you were about 10, and she stayed until she died 8 years later. Every decision about our household had to be filtered through her opinions. Every plan we made had to account for her needs. I loved her, but I lost myself completely during those years. The confession hung in the air between us, heavy with implications. All this time, I thought her assumption that I'd welcome her permanent presence was based on typical family expectations. I'd never considered that it might be based on her own experience of what dutiful daughters were supposed to do, even when it cost them everything. Is that why you never wanted to burden us when Dad got sick? I asked, remembering how fiercely she'd insisted on managing his care herself, refusing offers of help that might have made things easier for all of us. She nodded. I didn't want to do to you what my mother had done to me, but then, when I found myself alone and scared, I forgot that lesson. I convinced myself this situation was different because I was choosing to live with you, rather than you being obligated to take care of me. But I would have been obligated, I said, understanding now why this conversation had been so necessary. Not legally, but emotionally. Once you were here, once you'd given up your apartment and moved in, how could I have asked you to leave? The obligation would have been just as real as if you'd moved in because you were sick. Yes, she said simply. And eventually, you would have hated me for it. The brutal honesty of this statement took my breath away. She understood exactly what she'd been asking of me, had known the likely outcome of her plan, and had been prepared to accept my eventual resentment as the price of her security. It was manipulative, yes, but it was also heartbreakingly human in its desperation. I wouldn't have hated you, I said, though we both knew that wasn't entirely true. But I would have resented you, and that resentment would have poisoned whatever genuine affection exists between us. She met my eyes directly for the first time since we'd started this conversation. What happens now? Do we have genuine affection between us, or have I damaged that beyond repair? It was such a vulnerable question, asked with the kind of raw honesty that I'd never heard from her before. Looking at her in that moment, I saw not the imperious woman who'd arrived at my door with suitcases and assumptions, but someone who'd spent most of her adult life trying to manage her fears by controlling her environment. Someone who'd never learned how to ask for what she needed without taking more than was offered. We have something, I said carefully, maybe not what either of us thought we had, but something real, something we can build on if we're both willing to do it differently. She nodded, wiping her eyes again with that same gesture that made her look young and uncertain. I want to try. I don't want to be the kind of mother who only knows how to love people by making them responsible for my happiness. And I want to be the kind of daughter who can love you without losing myself, I replied. I think those two goals might actually be compatible. We finished packing in comfortable silence, both of us lost in our own thoughts about what came next. By the time we'd organized everything she'd need for the next few days, it was nearly 10 o'clock, and I was exhausted in the way that comes from emotional honesty rather than physical exertion. I'll sleep in the guest room tonight, she said, as we turned off the living room lights, and tomorrow we'll start figuring out the logistics of getting me home. Mother, I said, as we reached the top of the stairs. Yes, I'm glad you came today. Not because I wanted you to move in, but because we needed to have this conversation. We should have had it years ago. She smiled, and this time the expression was completely genuine, free of the calculated charm she usually wore like armor. I'm glad too, even though it didn't go the way I expected. Especially because it didn't go the way you expected, I corrected gently. The next morning brought the practical realities of undoing the arrangements she'd made. Phone calls to Mr. Hensworth, who turned out to be remarkably understanding about the situation once we explained it properly. Coordination with Dashiell, who had grudgingly started the process of moving his things back out. A trip to the apartment to assess what needed to be done to restore it to the condition Mother preferred. Standing in her living room, seeing her furniture back where it belonged and her books arranged on the shelves exactly as she liked them, I understood something that had been missing from all our previous conversations about independence and family obligation. This wasn't just about me learning to say no, or her learning to ask rather than assume. This was about both of us recognizing that loving someone doesn't require sacrificing your sense of self to their needs. It looks good, she said, settling into her favorite chair with a sigh of satisfaction. It looks like home. It is home, I agreed. Your home where you can make your own decisions and live according to your own preferences. She looked around the familiar space with something that might have been wonder, as if she were seeing it clearly for the first time in months. I can't believe I was willing to give this up. You were scared, I said, understanding now that fear had been driving most of her recent decisions. But being scared doesn't mean you have to make choices that hurt other people. There are other ways to address fear. Like what? I thought about this question while she waited, considering all the resources and options that existed for someone in her position. Not just family members who could be pressed into service, but community resources, professional services, friendship networks that could provide support without requiring anyone to sacrifice their independence. Like building a support system that doesn't depend on making one person responsible for your entire sense of security, I said finally. Like planning for the future in ways that give you options instead of just hoping someone else will solve your problems when they arise. She nodded thoughtfully. That sounds like something I should probably learn how to do. It's something we could learn together, I offered, surprising myself with the suggestion, not as a caretaker and dependent, but as two adults who care about each other and want to make sure we both have what we need. The smile that spread across her face was bright with genuine pleasure, the kind of expression I remembered from the rare moments in my childhood when she'd been truly happy rather than just satisfied with having gotten her way. That afternoon, Dashiell arrived to collect the last of his belongings and to have what turned out to be our most honest conversation in years. He was sullen at first, clearly still processing the loss of what he'd seen as a perfect solution to his housing problems. But, as Mother and I explained what had really been happening, the financial arrangements he'd been unaware of, the assumptions that had been made about my willingness to support everyone's decisions, his attitude began to shift. "I had no idea you were helping with Mom's rent," he said, looking genuinely surprised and somewhat ashamed. "She never mentioned it." "Because she was hoping to keep it quiet while making me responsible for yours too," I replied, not unkindly, but with complete clarity about what had been happening. He was quiet for a long moment, processing this information and its implications. "So when I thought she was being generous with me, she was actually being generous with your money?" "Partly, yes," I confirmed. "And when she thought she was solving her housing situation by moving in with me, she was actually creating a situation where I'd be financially and emotionally responsible for both of you, while neither of you had any responsibility for your own problems." The bluntness of this statement seemed to hit him like a physical blow. He sat down heavily on Mother's sofa, running his hands through his hair in a gesture I recognized from our childhood whenever he'd been caught in some mischief that had gotten out of hand. "I'm 45 years old," he said finally. "I shouldn't need my sister to solve my problems for me." "No, you shouldn't," I agreed. "But the fact that you do sometimes doesn't make you a terrible person. It just makes you human. We all need help sometimes. The issue isn't needing help. It's the expectation that help will always be available, regardless of the cost to the person providing it." He looked up at me with an expression I hadn't seen since we were children, genuine curiosity about my perspective, rather than just waiting for his turn to explain why his needs should take precedence. "How do I change that?" It was the same question Mother had asked the day before, and it opened up the same possibilities for a different kind of relationship. Not one based on the established patterns of our childhood, but one that acknowledged who we'd all become as adults. By starting to see the people around you as individuals with their own needs, instead of just resources for solving your problems, I said. By asking what someone can actually offer, instead of assuming what they should be willing to sacrifice. The conversation that followed was difficult in the way that all honest conversations about long-established family dynamics tend to be. There were moments of defensiveness, flashes of the old patterns where he tried to make his problem sound more urgent or more deserving of attention than anyone else's needs. But there were also moments of genuine recognition, times when I could see him actually hearing what I was saying instead of just formulating his next argument. By the time he left that evening, we'd established some new ground rules for how he could ask for help and how I might choose to respond. Not a blanket refusal to ever assist him, but a clear framework that required him to present actual plans rather than just crises, and that gave me permission to say no without having to justify my decision with detailed explanations of my own needs and limitations. "I'll figure something out," he said, as he gathered his keys and wallet. "For the apartment, I mean. I won't keep asking you to fix things for me." "I believe you," I said, and somewhat to my surprise, I did believe him. Not because I thought he'd transformed overnight, but because I thought he'd finally understood that the old system wasn't working for anyone, not even him. That evening, Mother and I sat in her living room, drinking tea and talking about practical matters, her doctor's appointments, her social activities, her plans for the autumn months ahead. ordinary conversation between two women who were learning how to be in each other's lives without being responsible for each other's happiness. "I've been thinking about what you said," she told me as we prepared to say goodnight, "about building a support system that doesn't depend on making one person responsible for everything." "What kinds of things have you been thinking?" She set down her teacup with the careful precision that characterized all her movements. "There's a senior center in town that offers social activities and day trips. I've always thought it wasn't for me, but maybe I was being foolish about that. And there's a woman in my building, Mrs. Pemberton, who's mentioned several times that she'd like someone to go to the library with her on Tuesday afternoons." These were small things, perhaps, but they represented a fundamental shift in how she was thinking about her social needs. Instead of expecting me to be her primary source of companionship and support, she was considering how to build connections that would enrich her life without depleting anyone else's. "Those sound like good ideas," I said. "And if you ever want company for something specific, a doctor's appointment or a shopping trip or just dinner out somewhere, you can always ask. Not assume, but ask. And you can say no if you're not available or if you simply don't want to do it," she added, as if she were practicing a new language. "Exactly." We hugged goodnight, a gesture that felt different from any embrace we'd shared in years. Not the perfunctory affection of people going through familiar motions, but genuine warmth between two people who'd finally figured out how to see each other clearly. Over the following weeks, we settled into a new rhythm. Mother called occasionally, sometimes with questions about practical matters, sometimes just to chat about her day or mine. The conversations were shorter than our previous interactions, but they felt more substantial somehow, more genuine in their focus on actual communication rather than the complex negotiations that had previously characterized most of our exchanges. Dashiell found a studio apartment across town, small but affordable, and seemed to be making a genuine effort to manage his finances more responsibly. He still called when he was struggling with something, but the calls were different now. Instead of presenting crises that required immediate intervention, he'd outline his problem, mention what he'd already tried, and ask for specific advice rather than general rescue. The changes weren't dramatic or immediately transformative. We were still the same people with the same basic personalities and the same long history of complicated family dynamics. But something fundamental had shifted in how we related to each other, something that made even difficult conversations feel possible in ways they hadn't before. 3 months later, Mother called me on a Saturday morning with what I initially thought was another crisis requiring my immediate attention. "I've fallen," she said without preamble, "and I think I might need to go to the emergency room." My first instinct was the familiar surge of panic and responsibility, the immediate mental reorganization of my day around someone else's urgent needs. But then I noticed something different in her tone, something that made me pause before launching into crisis management mode. "Are you hurt badly?" I asked. "Do you need an ambulance?" "No, I don't think so," she said. "Mrs. Pemberton is here with me and she thinks I've just twisted my ankle, but I can't put any weight on it, and I thought I should have it looked at properly." Mrs. Pemberton, the neighbor she'd mentioned wanting to spend more time with, who had apparently become enough of a friend to be called in an emergency. The fact that Mother had someone else to turn to for immediate assistance felt like a small miracle, a sign that her efforts to build a broader support network were actually working. "Would you like me to meet you at the hospital?" I asked, the question carrying a different weight than it would have 6 months earlier. This was an offer, not an assumption of obligation. "Would you mind?" she asked, and I could hear genuine gratitude in her voice rather than the expectation that had always colored her previous requests for help. "Of course not," I said, already reaching for my car keys. "I'll see you there." The emergency room visit turned out to be minor, a sprained ankle that would heal with rest and careful attention, but didn't require any dramatic intervention. What struck me most about the experience was how different it felt from the family crises of the past. Mother had handled the immediate problem herself, had arranged for her own transportation, had only called me after she'd taken care of the urgent necessities. I was there to provide emotional support and additional advocacy if needed, but I wasn't carrying the entire weight of the situation by myself. "Thank you for coming," she said, as we waited for the discharge paperwork, her ankle properly wrapped and elevated on the hospital bed. "Thank you for handling this so competently," I replied, meaning it completely. 6 months ago, this would have been a different kind of crisis. She smiled, understanding exactly what I meant. 6 months ago, I would have called you first and expected you to figure out what to do next. And I would have done it, I admitted, but I would have resented every minute of it, and you would have felt guilty about that resentment even while continuing to expect me to handle things. "It's better this way," she said quietly. "Harder sometimes, but better." Driving her home that afternoon, I reflected on how much had changed since that September day when she'd appeared on my doorstep with suitcases and assumptions. Not just in our family dynamics, but in how I thought about independence and interdependence, about the difference between loving someone and being consumed by their needs. The house I returned to that evening was quiet in the way I'd grown to treasure, filled with the peaceful solitude I'd fought to protect. But the solitude felt different now, chosen rather than defensive, secure rather than fragile. I'd learned that it was possible to maintain boundaries without building walls, to be available for the people I loved without being enslaved by their problems. That night, as I sat in my garden with a cup of tea, watching the autumn light fade through the apple tree I'd planted in my first year of living alone, I thought about the words I'd said to my mother that day in September, the declaration that had shocked her and changed everything between us. Not because the words themselves had been particularly dramatic, but because they had represented a fundamental shift in how I understood my own worth and agency. I'd told her she was moving back to her own apartment, and in doing so, I'd claimed the right to make decisions about my own life without having to justify them to anyone else. I'd discovered that love didn't require me to sacrifice my own well-being for someone else's convenience, and that saying no to one thing meant saying yes to something else. In this case, to a version of myself that I'd almost lost in all those years of automatic accommodation. The phone rang as I was finishing my tea, and I smiled when I saw Mother's name on the caller ID. "How's the ankle?" I asked. "Better, thank you. Mrs. Pemberton made me a casserole for dinner, and I've got my foot propped up just like the doctor ordered." She paused, and when she continued, her voice carried a warmth I'd rarely heard there before. "I wanted to call and tell you how much I appreciated your help today. Not just because you came to the hospital, but because you let me handle things my own way first." You did handle them well, I said. I was proud of you. I was proud of me, too, she admitted with a laugh. Imagine that. After we hung up, I remained in the garden for a while longer, thinking about family and independence and the complex dance of caring for people without losing yourself in the process. The evening was crisp and clear, full of the promise of changing seasons and new possibilities. In the distance, I could see lights beginning to come on in other houses, other lives unfolding behind other windows, each family finding their own way through the challenges of loving each other without destroying themselves in the process. 6 months ago, the sight of those other houses had made me feel grateful for my solitude, relieved to be free from the complications that seemed to define so many family relationships. Tonight, they made me feel connected to something larger than myself, part of a community of people who were all trying to figure out how to be fully themselves while remaining meaningfully connected to the people who mattered to them. It was possible, I'd learned. Difficult, requiring constant attention and occasional, painful honesty, but definitely possible. And that possibility felt like the most valuable thing I'd ever fought to protect.